الحمد لله الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. After praising Allah Ta'ala, sending salutations upon our beloved Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we make dua to Allah as always that He grants us beneficial knowledge which gains us His pleasure, His closeness. Ameen Ya Rabbal Alameen. May Allah Ta'ala bless you all and your families. So today we'll be discussing regarding wiping on casts. When a person has a cast on or a bandage on or a dressing on, then how do you perform wudu, or how do you perform ghusl? So you only have to wipe over the cast, not the entire cast, if you can, and wash the rest of the limbs. That is excused. That's the simple understanding of it, and we'll talk about the detailed rulings here. Then we'll move on to menstruation, the hayd, the postnatal bleeding, the nifas, and the dysfunctional uterine bleeding, the istihada of a woman. And we'll be discussing these three, the hayd, nifas, and istihada, and their rulings. The hayd obviously is the menstrual blood that a woman goes through, and the nifas is postnatal bleeding after giving birth. These two share the same ruling, so we put them together. Both of them share the exact same ruling in terms that you do not perform salat during those times, and nor do you have to make up for salat afterwards that are missed during those times. And also you cannot fast during those times, though the fasting will have to be made up afterwards. And likewise there's other rulings which we'll talk about during these, like you can't have sexual intercourse, you can't break Quran, you can't enter a masjid, and things like this. So we'll talk about them things in detail. Then we will talk about istihada, which is this dysfunctional uterine bleeding. This is just bleeding, you can simply understand due to an illness, due to some sort of wound or something like this. So this is not the shedding of the womb lining. This is a bleeding that will happen. It will still come out like, it will look like maybe even menstruation, but it will not be considered according to Sharia menstrual blood. It will be dysfunctional uterine bleeding, and we will talk about the rulings of that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. So now starting today from wiping casts. So wiping over a cast. So if a person has a wound, say if one has a broken or wounded limb, he may wipe its cast. So you've got a cast on for a fractured or broken limb or something like this, right? So then you are wiping over the cast or a bandage or dressing for as long as the excuse remains. So as long as the wound is there or the broken limb is there and you've got a cast on, or you've got a bandage on or dressing on, then you can wipe over it. Even if it were placed on the limb while the person was in a state of major or minor ritual impurity. So it doesn't matter if you needed ghusl. So even if you needed ghusl, you were in a state of major ritual impurity and you put this cast on, and then you said, oh, I need to do a ghusl. So it's fine, you can still do the ghusl, wash the rest of the limbs, all the parts that are exposed, wash everything. Then the part that is in a cast, so if you got your arm in a cast, the whole arm is in a cast like this, then you just wipe over that. Wet hand and just wipe over it, and it's all fine, no problem. You do not wash the cast, obviously, and you have to do things to make sure that the cast doesn't get wet. You put it into a plastic bag, or you put something over it to make sure it doesn't get wet. But yeah, so that is allowed. It is not a condition to wipe the entire cast, although it is according to the weaker opinion. So you don't have to wipe the entire cast, just wipe majority of it. It's fine. It is also not necessary to wash the exposed skin in between the wrapping of the dressing placed over skin where a venesection of the like was performed. So a cannula, for example, was inserted into a vein, and there was plaster or like there was or it was dressed. The dressing was put on, but then there was part in between that was exposed of the skin. So if a part of the skin was exposed, then it's not necessary to wash that part, because then the rest of the dressing, everything else will become wet and potentially cause maybe even infection in the if the water goes into the veins and whatever else. So it's not necessary to wash that part of the skin that is exposed. You just have to wipe over that part of the skin, because the rest of the limb hopefully would have been washed. That 2 drops would have been falling off the limb, so that means that part, if you wet it to the extent that it just wiped over it with water, that would be sufficient. So that's that. Moving on, if the cast or bandage falls off and the limb had not yet healed, then neither the previous wiping nor the ritual prayer, if he were praying, is invalidated. So if you were praying and the cast or the plaster or the dressing falls off, and you can still see the wound is not healed, so you're going to have to finish your prayer and you have to put that dressing back on, then you can carry on your prayer, it's all fine. But if the next one that mentions, if a new cast or bandage is placed on the wounded limb to replace the older one, it is not necessary to wipe it if the original one had previously been wiped, yet it is recommended to do. So what it's meaning is, before we move on to that one, actually, let me finish the explanation of the previous one. So if the cast falls off and you see that the wound has actually healed to the extent that you do not have to put that dressing back on, or that bandage, whatever it is, back on, then your prayer will now break, because you can see it's healed. You didn't require that plaster, meaning you didn't require to do that wiping over the plaster, over the bandage. You were not required to do that. You thought it was not clean, it was not cured, but whilst you were praying, it came off and you saw it was cured. So now it becomes incumbent on you to wash that limb. So you're gonna have to actually go and wash that limb. You don't have to do your whole wudu again. You just have to wash that limb, right? Because your wudu didn't break. It's just that part of your arm, if for example it's on your arm, is in essence not done wudu of. So that's that. If the next one, which we already read, so if, for example, I have wudu right now, and I wiped over my cast, then I needed to change my dressing or cast, whatever it was. I needed to change it, but I still have wudu on. I still have wudu, no problem. My wudu hasn't broken. So when I redress and I change my dressing or bandage, then I don't have to do a new mash over the new bandage. I don't have to do that. My previous wudu continues. Okay, so unlike in wiping, it says like hoofs, for example, unlike the hoofs whereby you would need to, obviously by taking the hoofs off, you're going to have to wash the feet and then put the hoofs back on. So that's that. Then it says, like the hoofs, wiping the cast does not require an intention. So in hoofs and in wiping over the cast, you don't need an intention specifically, because that's part of wudu. The intention was needed, if you remember, in dry ablution. So that's that. Then moving on to our next topic, which is menstruation, haid, postnatal bleeding, nifas, and dysfunctional uterine bleeding, istihada. So there are 3 types of bleeding that a woman will experience when it's haid, nifas, or istihada. Menstruation, i.e. menstrual blood, haid, is defined as blood that exits from the uterus of a woman free from disease or pregnancy after the age of adolescence, after the age of puberty. So after the age of puberty, blood that comes out of the private area of the woman, and it's coming from the uterus, from the shedding of the womb, and it's not of any disease, she's not pregnant, then a woman, this is the menstrual blood. Its minimum duration is 3 days, which is 72 hours. Again, 3 days. I always tell you to remember the hours. Hours are the more important thing, the 72 hours. While its maximum is 10 days, 240 hours. So 24 hours times 10, 240 hours. Its average is between the two, i.e., between the two, meaning 5 days. So average is 5 days, because obviously 1 to 10 average is 5. Obviously, it depends on the woman, really. So that's the menstrual blood. If the bleeding is for less than 3 days, less than 72 hours, or more than 10 days, more than 240 hours, then it the meaning the excess blood, only the excess blood, is not menstruation. So meaning more than 10 days, the excess blood is not menstruation, and less than the 72 hours, less than 3 days, then that's also not menstruation. Rather, it is dysfunctional uterine bleeding, which is the istihada. It's considered to be the istihada, and the rulings of each one will follow. During the period of menstruation, i.e., it's maximum 10 complete days, the 204 hours, any color that is seen, any color, yeah, as well as during intermittent breaks from bleeding. You have breaks of bleeding. You don't bleed all the way. A woman, if she bleeds for 10 days, she's not going to bleed 240 hours bleeding constantly, because then that means she needs to go to the hospital, losing too much blood. So it's going to be intermittent breaks. It's going to be bleeding on day 1, day 2, day 3 may not be much bleeding, and then day 4 might be no bleeding, then day 5 may be bleeding again, like that. So the intermittent breaks between bleeding, again, within the possible 10 complete days, so it has to be within the 10 complete days, is considered menstrual blood. All of this intermittent break, as well as any color, all of this is considered within bleeding, is all considered menstruation. So though she's not actually bleeding on day 4 or on day 5, that's still menstruation, thus preventing her from praying or fasting. That's not allowed. The fasts must be made up. If during Ramadan, the compulsory fasts must be made up, as opposed to the prayers. The prayers do not have to be made up. That's forgiven. The prayers are forgiven, but the fasts are only a few. So they've got, you've got a whole year to make that up. So that one we should make up. So that's the ruling. The following things are also unlawful during menstruation: sexual intercourse, not allowed. This is from the Quran. فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض, that قل هو أذى, that say it is other, it is it's going to give you harm, it's harmful. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, فاعتزلوا النساء, so stay away from the woman, meaning don't have sexual intercourse with her during the haid, during menstruation. So that's what's not allowed. Second thing not allowed is tawaf. She's not allowed to do circumambulation around the Kaaba. She's not allowed to do tawaf around the Kaaba during the time of her menstruation. Likewise, entering a mosque, any masjid, any sacred prayer area, masjid which is deemed to be a masjid, even if only passing through it, is not allowed for a menstruating woman. Being touched from right below the navel, so from right below the navel to right below the knees, so from navel to knee, just basically the aura of a man, from that part you can't touch that part. Skin to skin, skin to skin is not allowed to be touched. That's the most predominant ruling, the fatwa that is given according to that opinion. Though if a person feels, if the husband, for example, feels the urge, then you can leave her, under clothing on, so you can keep the trouser or whatever it is on from navel to knee, keep it covered, and then with that barrier of cloth, then you can caress or you can do something, if a person wants to experience pleasure in that way. So that is allowed. So using a barrier is allowed, but without a barrier is not allowed. So that's that. moving on. Then it says reciting the Quran. So recitation of the Quran again is not allowed during the state of menstruation. So this is something which is brought up a lot, contention that it's not her fault and the rest of it, but this is something which is within our school, proven from hadith. There are many articles out there proving as to why it's not allowed. A person should be in a state of utmost purity when reciting the kalam of Allah, the words of Allah. So this is not allowed, the recitation of Quran during the state of menstruation. And this is not as a way of punishment, just as if a woman is not allowed to pray during this time, it's like a holiday, a time off for the woman from all of this type of worship. It's not like she can't do, for example, she can't make dua. She can make dua, she can do adhkar, she can say other forms of dhikr of Allah Ta'ala, mentioning the names of Allah or reciting any other dhikr of Allah Ta'ala, mentioning that is allowed. Likewise, listening to the Quran, that is allowed. Okay, so these are all things that are allowed, but you can't recite the Quran in the state of menstruation. Likewise, moving on to the next one, touching a copy of the Quran unless with a barrier. So this is something also that is not allowed, touching the copy of the Quran. Moving on, if her period ends within 10 days, but after the duration of her regular habit. So let's say her regular habit is 6 days, but this time she finished at 8 days. So her period ended within 10 days, 8 days in our example, but after the duration of her regular habit was 6 days, so after that it ended. She may not have intercourse except after one of three things that have to have happened. So one of these three things that are coming next have to have happened. Then only she is allowed to have sexual intercourse with her husband. Number one is performing a ghusl. She either goes and performs ghusl because her period ended on day 8, for example, or day 9, for example. So she has to go and have a ghusl. That's number one. Then she can have sexual intercourse. Number two, performing tayammum, if there is a valid excuse, as well as praying salat with that tayammum, even if it be voluntary prayer. So she is unable to do ghusl because of whatever reasons we prayed before, and she is now allowed to do dry ablution tayammum. So she can do that tayammum, but she also has to pray salat with that tayammum, even if it be nafil prayer, voluntary prayer. Then now she has come into the ruling where sexual intercourse is allowed with her, or she's allowed to have sexual intercourse. Or number three is missing an obligatory prayer. So she misses the entire prayer. So she became pure and she missed a obligatory prayer. For example, she missed Fajr. She missed it completely, which occurs if her period ends with enough time. So how does this missing an obligatory prayer happen? So it's when her period ends with enough time to at least perform ghusl. That's number one, perform ghusl, and say the takbir tahrima, say the tahrima, okay, before the prayer time expires. So this is the amount of time she needs. So let's just put a time on that for a rough estimation. So if we say it takes around about, if a person does ghusl and just does the fard ghusl only, gargles quickly, puts water into the nose and washes the entire body. So let's say that maybe give or take takes a person between 7 minutes to 10 minutes. Just be generous and say 10 minutes for argument's sake. So if a person takes 10 minutes to do this ghusl, and then to, that's including drying themselves, putting their clothes on, then they come and stand on the musalla and do takbir tahrim Allahu Akbar. That will take another minute maximum. Let's just say a minute or 2 minutes. So if a person had this much time, all right, for according to our estimation now, about 12 minutes. It could be less than that. A person may argue that, no, it takes 5 minutes to take a ghusl and it takes 2 minutes for that, so 7 minutes. That's fine. That's up to you. You can argue whatever you want to. But the point is to give you an understanding that the amount of time, around about 12 minutes, if we say, is needed for until the end of time. She doesn't actually go and take this ghusl. The idea is this much time is there till the end of prayer time. So she finished, for example, at Dhuhr end time. towards the end of Dhuhr time, there was about, let's say there was about 15 minutes left for Asr time to start. And she now finished her menstruation. At that time, she finished the menstruation. There was 15 minutes left. That 15 minutes, she didn't do anything. She could have quickly rushed, done a ghusl, and then prayed her salat quickly. But she didn't do that. So this much amount of time went. So that means this missing of an obligatory prayer has happened for her. She has missed that obligatory prayer. She's going to have to make up for that dhuhr. So that's what it means here when it says that she performed and says the tahrima before the prayer time expires. If that occurs, if this much time occurs, then it is permissible to have sexual intercourse with her afterwards, even if she did not perform the ghusl. So she missed the prayer. She actually missed that dhuhr now. So now he can have sexual intercourse with her. So this is because a person might be confused. Why is this the ruling? This is because it's a knock-on effect. It's a domino effect, basically. The idea is that Shariat is saying to this woman that you're going to have to pray that dhuhr. Like in our example, you're going to have to make up for that dhuhr. So the question is, why does she have to make up for that dhuhr? So she has to make up for that dhuhr because Shariat is addressing her, is making her mukhatab, is addressing her. Remember we prayed before that the address is directed towards her. So Shariat is addressing her to pray. Whereas when she was in a state of menstruation, when she was in a state of her hayd, Shariat was not addressing her to pray because she was excused. But when she has finished her menstruation, Shariat is addressing her, pray now. But she's not praying. So that salat becomes qada on her. Now the question arises, why is there salat on her? Why are you addressing her? Shariat is saying, oh, because she's pure. So the husband will turn around and say, oh, she's pure. Okay, then if she's pure, that means I can now have sexual intercourse with her. Oh yeah, you can have sexual intercourse with her because we have now stated that she is pure. Though she's not technically pure, she still has to go and take her ghusl. So she's not pure, but she has now come into the ruling of a person who is pure. So therefore, she will be allowed to have sexual intercourse now. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a knock-on effect, basically, of obliging salat on her. So that's that. Now, moving on, finishing off, if, however, the time between the ending of her period and the expiration of the prayer time is very slight, is so small, such that she would not have enough time to take a ghusl, coupled with the tahrima, do a ghusl, dry herself, wear her clothes, come into the musalla and do takbir tahrima. Just do takbir tahrima only, Allahu Akbar, that much only. Then she is not considered to have missed that obligatory prayer because she did not get enough time. So she only literally had 3 minutes left, and 3 minutes, that's when her hayd menstruation ended, and there were 3 minutes left for the dhuhr salat only. So now she can't possibly have done a ghusl, dried herself, come out and done takbir tahrima Allahu Akbar in them 3 minutes. It's too short a time, or 2 minutes is too short a time. So that dhuhr will not be qada on her, will not be obligatory on her. She does not have to make up for that prayer. So now that she doesn't have to make up for that prayer, Shariat did not rule for her to be in the state of a pure person. Shariat didn't address her. So the next prayer has to be then missed. And then all of Asr time goes and she didn't pray the Asr, full Asr time goes, she didn't pray, then we will say, okay, now she has come into the state because Asr is now due on her. Because she had plenty of time in Asr time, yes? So then again it says, then intercourse would remain impermissible if there was only a short amount of time. So hopefully people have understood that one. If her period goes past 10 days, so this was when the period was before 10 days. Now if the period goes beyond 10 days, so she bled for beyond 10 days. Now only 10 days of that would be her period, her menstruation. Beyond 10 days is not menstruation, yes? So then it is permissible to have sexual intercourse with her as soon as it passes the 10th day, meaning 240 hours complete. So as soon as 240 complete hours are finished, then you're allowed to have sexual intercourse without the need of ghusl, without the need of bath. Due to the certainty, this is because due to the certainty that the menstruation is complete and that the extra bleeding is dysfunctional uterine bleeding, which is obviously uterine bleeding, the istihada, as we call it. The minimum duration of tuhur, the minimum duration of purity. Tuhur is a purity between two bleeds. So the minimum duration of the tuhur, which is important also to recognize the ruling of menstruation, is 15 days, complete days, which is 360 complete hours. So 15 days, 15 times 24, 240 hours. 24 hours per day. So it's 360 hours. So that 360 complete hours have to pass between two bleeds for that tohr to be a proper complete tohr. Yet it has no maximum duration. Maximum duration carries on going. It could be for a whole long year or whatever, okay? Except when establishing a standard menstrual habit in a situation of continuous bleeding. So here we'll put a maximum of 6 months, less than 6 months, because 6 months is duration of pregnancy. So anyway, that will come, if it does come later. It's no need to go into the complicated rulings there, but just to understand there's no duration of max, but there is a duration for tohr. In the minimum, it has to be at least 360 hours, 15 days. So that, the tohr, why is that needed, is to understand that when you have a bleed, then you have a menstruation, meaning, so let's say 15, so you had 8 days or 6 days or 7 days of bleed, you have to have a 15-day tohr period after it, and then your next cycle of menstruation can start. It can start. But if it did not have 15 days in between, so you had 6 days of bleed and then only 10 days of purity in between, and then your bleeding started, that next bleeding directly cannot be menstruation. It can't be menstruation because there has to be a 15-day purity of tohr in between two bleeds minimum. There has to be at least 15 days. So you would have to now go and determine habit. What was the habit? And you have to find out what the habit was and then insert habits, which is much more complicated rulings, which if it comes later, we will discuss that. But otherwise, for these kind of rulings, you have to study the specialist fiqh books on menstruation to understand the deeper rulings. But this is just to understand the gist of it. But this is why it's vital, very important. I always mention when we discuss these things, it's vital that women record their habits, record the date and the time that it started and the date and time it ended. Just type it in on your phone. If you have a phone, just put it in the calendar, started on this date, what time. Write the time, don't write the salat time. Some people write salat times, but it's not really helpful salat times later on, especially when salat times are huge like dhuhr. So write the time it started, okay, 11 o'clock or 2 o'clock or wherever it may be. Just write the time and the date, and when it ends, time and date again. Very important to have this record, because later on, sometime in life, wherever there's an imbalance in hormones and things, and it sends a woman's menstrual cycle all over the place, then this will be needed to determine when her menstruation is and when her purity is. And now we move on to the postnatal bleeding, or lochia, nifas as it's called, is defined as blood that exits after delivery, after delivering a child, after giving birth to a child, or after most of the baby has exited. So as long as most of the child has been delivered, then the bleeding that happens after it, subsequent to it, is considered to be this nifas, postnatal bleeding. Even after miscarriage of a fetus whose body had some sort of physical development. So as long as the limbs were physically developed of this fetus, and then she had a miscarriage, we're talking generally features start forming at week 9 to 12 roughly. So if she had a miscarriage after that period, then any bleeding will be considered this postnatal bleeding too. Anything which is earlier than that, if it's at week 8 or week 7, week 6, that's too early. Features would probably not have formed. Postnatal bleeding has no minimum duration. There's no minimum duration. It could last a moment. It could last an hour. It could last a moment. It doesn't have to last. In the minimum, there's no duration. Whilst its maximum duration is 40 days, which is 960 complete hours again. So 960 hours, that's the maximum that you could have a postnatal bleed, the nifas, for. It is from the first, if there's twins that are born, then it's from the first of the twins. If the first twin was born a little while earlier, and maybe a little while later, the second twin was born, the nifas would have started from the first already. It's meaning the timer of 960 hours would have already started. Its ruling, i.e., the postnatal bleeding, is like that of menstruation. So menstruation and postnatal bleeding are the same in terms of ruling, in meaning, namely, you cannot pray Quran, salat in it. There's no salat, and there's no qada for that salat too, and there's no fasting. But the fasting there is qada for, and then all the other rulings of not being able to pray the mushaf, the Quran. There's no sexual intercourse allowed, and all of the other rulings during that as well. The following cases are considered to be dysfunctional uterine bleeding. So now we're talking about the istihada, and any bleeding of a pregnant woman. So whilst a woman is pregnant, even bleeding during delivery, whilst actual delivery, before most of the baby is exited. So before most of the baby is delivered, all of that is dysfunctional uterine bleeding. The second point he's saying is bleeding after delivery for more than 40 days, i.e., excess blood is the excess blood. So if you bled for 45 days, 40 days would have been the nifas, would have been the postnatal bleeding, and 5 days extra on top would have been this dysfunctional uterine bleeding. If she bleeds past her normal habit, or either menstruation or postnatal bleeding, and the bleeding exceeds the maximum duration of either one, in that case, the bleeding after the duration of her habit is considered dysfunctional uterine bleeding. So what it means is that in menstruation, so for example, let's say her normal habit was 6 days, and this time she bled for 11 days. Then day 7, day 8, day 9, day 10, day 11, all 5 days will be now dysfunctional uterine bleeding. All 5 days will be considered the istihada. So all the way from day 7. Why? Because she bled beyond 10 days. So she exceeded the maximum duration. So because she exceeded maximum duration, that's why we have to go all the way back to the habit, which was 6 days. So 6 days were her habit. So anything beyond the 6 days is going to be now istihada. But if she bled beyond 6 days but ended before she finished within 10 days, so she finished on day 9, so she bled beyond her normal habit, which is 6 days. She went beyond the habit. She bled on day 7, day 8, and day 9 as well. But at day 9, it was finished. It was completely clear. And she had, after that, she had a 15-day tuhur, purity. So she had a 15-day savior period, we call it, right? The period which saves her from complication. So she had, after day 9, she has a 15-day purity. Then she is okay. All 9 days would have been her menstruation. It would have been her haid. But if she bled for 9 days in our case, and then she had less than 15 days, then everything's ruined basically. Only 6 days would have been considered to be her haid, because that's her normal habit. And day 7, day 8, day 9, all of that will be dysfunctional uterine bleeding, will be now a istihada. Why? Because she did not have 15 days between this bleed that she had for 9 days and the next bleed that started. So she needs that 15 days, as we mentioned previously. So this now, it comes into play. You can see how the 15 days, the tuhur, the period of purity, comes into play over here. So anyway, this particular point was mentioning regarding going beyond the maximum. So I gave you the explanation of going beyond the maximum menstruation. So I'm going to just give you an example of postnatal bleeding now. So if a woman goes and she bleeds beyond 40 days, so like she bled for 45 days, we gave an example previous of, and this is her second baby. Her first baby that she delivered, she only had a 35-day postnatal bleeding, a nifas. So now that she's gone on to 45 days, we'll have to go back to habit. So she had 35 days of habit from the first baby that she gave birth to. So now only 35 days out of the 45 that she bled for to this time. 45 she bled for this time, right? Second baby. So only 35 days of that would be her nifas, her postnatal bleeding, and the rest of the 10 days from day 45, 35 onwards, 36, all the way up to 45, the rest of the 10 days will all be now, her dysfunctional uterine bleeding will be istihadha. The point of that is, during istihadha, the woman will have to pray. She is still obliged to pray, so she'll have to make up for those prayers for those days. So that's what this particular third point means, exceeding, going beyond the maximum duration. Then you go back to habit. Okay, so if she bleeds past her normal habit in the menstruation or in a postnatal bleeding, then all of that excess bleeding will be dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Any bleeding, next point, any bleeding of a girl that has not yet reached adolescence. So if a girl is 5 years old and she's bleeding, unfortunately, then that will not be considered to be her menstruation, because it's too early. It's too early. So this is dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Now, moving forward, dysfunctional uterine bleeding, the istihada, is like a continuous nosebleed. It's like having nosebleed, or it's like having a wound anywhere else. Its legal ruling in terms is the same ruling. You have to try to stop the blood as much as you can. If it doesn't, then you come into the ruling of a excuse the person, which we will talk about later. It does not prevent the permissibility of fasting, praying, sexual intercourse, or tawaf, or anything else, or praying Quran, or anything else. So a person is considered to be pure in this state. They just have to stop the bleeding, and they do wudu and pray as much as they can, and whatever else. Okay. If such bleeding continues for the duration of an entire prayer time, now we're going into what happens if she continues bleeding throughout the whole prayer time in this istihadha, in this dysfunctional uterine bleeding. What will she do? Then the woman must perform wudu at the beginning of each prayer time. She will perform wudu at the beginning of each prayer time, subsequent prayer times, just like someone with a chronic uterine incontinence, or constant diarrhea, or constant gas release, or constant bleeding, or any other excuse which breaks their wudu constantly, from any other part of the body. So just as these people are excused, then in the same way here, this woman falls under the same ruling. She has an excuse. So what would she do? She would practically, that duration of that entire prayer time, she was continuously bleeding. At the end of that prayer time, doesn't matter if she's bleeding, she will just do wudu and she will pray that prayer, because she can't miss that prayer. So she will pray that prayer at the end of the prayer time. Then the subsequent prayer times, she would be now considered to be a excused person. So there are three conditions, three states, you can say three states for people with chronic excuses. The conditions or the states of establishing this: one is the state of establishing the excuse, the other is the condition or the state of its continuity, and the other is the condition of its termination, its revoking. So if you understand this state of chronic excuse to be like a membership to a club, so you're getting membership, you're being given by Sharia is giving you membership to a particular club. So you join the club of these chronically excused people. And these chronically excused people, they will do wudu at the beginning of a prayer time, and their wudu will be so powerful, they have like a immunity wudu. Their wudu will not break because of this chronic excuse that they have. So if they are bleeding, for example, if the woman is bleeding, then because of the bleeding that she is having, that wudu will not break. The wudu will break with all the other excuses of passing wind, or passing urine, or anything else, but the wudu will not break because of that excuse, because she is excused from that. Or if anybody else, they are excused from that excuse. They are excused from that particular chronic illness or whatever it is that they're going through. So they join the club basically, and the club gives them the power in their wudu, that their wudu won't break. They will do wudu at the beginning of that prayer time, and their wudu will last throughout that prayer time. At the end of that prayer time, that wudu depowers. It loses its power. It's no longer powerful anymore. So therefore, if that excuse happens again, meaning they bleed again, that wudu will break now at the end of the prayer time. So the end of the prayer time, when the next prayer time starts, they will do a new wudu, a fresh wudu. So they have a powerful wudu again. The wudu power comes back again, and that will last throughout that prayer time. They can carry on praying Quran, praying sunnats, nafils, fard, everything they can do throughout the whole duration of that prayer time with that one wudu. But if something else happens to break their wudu, like they fell asleep or they did anything else, they passed urine, then the wudu will break. They have to do that wudu because those things they are not excused from. So anyway, the point here is that this chronically excused person, they have to join the club first. So how do you join the club? Then how do you remain part of the club? And then how do you become terminated, no longer part of the club? So there's three stages here, and that's what it's explaining here, that the condition of establishing the excuse, as stated above, is for the excuse to continue for the duration of an entire prayer time. So for the excuse, that excuse has to remain throughout the whole prayer time, such that the person is unable to perform wudu and the prayer, they're unable to perform the prayer without the occurrence of the excuse. So they can't do wudu and pray the full prayer, that fard only, yes, and they don't have that much time. So let's just analyze, to do wudu, fard wudu only, it'll take you maybe 2-3 minutes, yes, and then to perform that 4 rakat of salat, for example, will take you another 4 minutes, for example, just performing the fara'id. So let's say a person needs about 6 or 7 minutes. 6 or 7 minutes, the person does not get 6 or 7 minutes duration through which that the bleeding didn't happen. The bleeding carried on happening. Every 2 minutes the bleeding's happening. It just keeps happening, keeps coming throughout the whole duration of a prayer time. So throughout the whole of Asr time, for example, the whole Asr time went in this state. Then the person is now given that admission into this club. Okay. Afterwards, so at the end of the Asr time, what would the person do? Like I explained previously, at the end of the prayer time, Asr, they would do wudu. Doesn't matter if they're bleeding, just pray, because they can't miss that prayer. So afterwards, the person is considered chronically excused. They are just excused, which we call ma'adhur person. Therefore, an excused person, he may perform, or they may perform, any amount of obligatory or voluntary prayers after having performed wudu with it, with the excuse, despite the occurrence of that excuse after the wudu. So the wudu performed in such a state is invalidated only by the expiration of the prayer time. So once the prayer time is over, like I said, the wudu depowers. It's like loses its power. So once it loses its power, what happens? The excuse that you have, the bleeding, for example, when that bleeding comes about, that wudu will then break. Okay. So that's how you join the club. Now, how do you remain part of the club? Number 2 is the condition of continuity of the excuse is its occurrence in every prayer time afterwards, even if only once within that prayer time. Meaning, that excuse that you have, for example, you're bleeding, that has to happen at least once during the duration of that next prayer time. So during the next prayer time, for example, Maghrib, at least once the excuse happened. So then you are still part of the club. Then next prayer time, Isha, the excuse happened at least once, then you are still part of the club. Like that, the excuse Karen happening at least once or even more than that, you are still part of the club. And then lastly, number 3 is how is this part of the club? This, you've joined the club and now you are no longer part of the club. Your membership is rescinded. The condition of its termination, whereby one is no longer excused or no longer part of the club, is for a prayer time to elapse without a single occurrence of the excuse. So the whole prayer time went, so for example, you got to Fajr time now. In the Fajr time, all from beginning till end of Fajr time, the excuse did not happen, not even once. You didn't bleed, not even once. So now Sharia takes you out of that club now. You are not part of the club anymore. You are no longer excused. In order to join the club again, you need to start the whole process again. The whole prayer time has to go, whereby you did not get an opportunity to do wudu and pray that prayer time in the state of purity. You did not get the chance to do that. If a whole prayer time passes again like this, then you join the club again. And then to remain part of the club again, you just have to have excuse once in the subsequent prayer times, and then to be again, Sharia will take it away from you when you have no longer that excuse standing. So just to summarize today what we did, we went through the rulings of wiping over a cast and a bandage or a dressing, and we talked about in detail regarding this. So if a person has a bandage or dressing or cast on, then you only need to wipe over it, and if you can't wipe over it, you don't even have to wipe over it if you can't. But generally you should be able to wipe a little bit over it, even if it be a little bit. The skin that is exposed in between, you don't have to wash it, you don't have to wipe it, is enough. All the rest of the body, wherever the cast or the dressing is not, you have to wash wherever it needs to be washed. If it's a ghusl or if it's wudu, then you have to do what you have to do for wudu. So that's the rulings regarding the bandage or the cast or the dressing. Then we went into detail regarding the hayd, nifas and istihada. The hayd and nifas, as we talked about, minimum, maximum times you need to remember. The menstruation, the hayd, minimum is 3 days, 72 hours, and maximum is 240 hours, 10 days. And for the nifas is no minimum period, but maximum is 40 days, which equates to 240 hours. No, sorry, not 240 hours, which equates to 960 hours, should I say, yes. So 40 days, which is 960 hours. So that's the maximum period for nifas. And when it comes to the next one, which is dysfunctional bleeding, there's no minimum or maximum for it. It's generally any other bleeding besides menstruation and postnatal. Anything else besides hayd and istihada will be, anything besides hayd and nifas will be istihada. So that's istihada, what istihada is. And the rulings in istihada is that the woman, she still has to pray during that time. She still has to do fasting during that time. Every other ruling is allowed as well, like she can pray Quran, she can enter the masjid, sexual intercourse is allowed. All of these things will be allowed during this particular time. And then we also went through the ruling of a ma'dhur, an excused person. So remembering the three main things, how to become instated as an excused person. So that is, you're joining, like, remember concept-wise, you're joining a club, like a disability club, you can imagine. So it's like a free pass that you get. So your wudu would be immune from that excuse that you are excused from. So how you join the club is that a whole duration of salat has to pass, a whole salat time has to pass, during which you did not get an opportunity to do wudu, clean yourself, do wudu, and then to pray. Before that happened, before that opportunity, that excuse happened again. So if you didn't get that opportunity, then you, throughout the whole prayer time, and the whole prayer time is going now, so at the end of prayer time, you will just do that wudu, pray in that illness, no problem, and then you will just be joining the club. Shariat will give you entry into this club. Once you've gained entry, you stay as part of member of the club. You are now ma'dhur person. You stay like that until, as long as in the subsequent prayer times, at least once that same excuse happens. So at least that same excuse happens once, and you carry on going. And how do you remove from that club is that whole duration, or a duration of the whole prayer time, goes without that excuse happening even once. So it didn't happen not even once. So then you are no longer part of the club. You are no longer excused from that excuse. So you are not a chronically excused person, and you will break for that excuse now.